Okay, yes, this is working. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
My name is Dan Schneider, and I'm a professor here at the School of International Service, and I am in the Foreign Policy and Global Security Department. And we welcome you to this, will be a important and certainly timely discussion called Deciding War. How far does presidential power go? Just so you know, we're recording today's discussion, and I want to let you know that because some of you will be asking questions later. So just that you know that your questions will be immortalized. So today's talk will try and answer at least three questions. Maybe answer is the wrong word, provide insight into the following three questions. What is the president's power to use military force? Where does the president's power come from? And what are the limits on the president's power to use military force? And of course, these questions are particularly timely because there is more than discussion right now about an imminent US attack on Iran. And if that attack occurs, it will be, depending on how you count the strikes in the Caribbean, as 1 or 20, it will be perhaps the third use of military force in the first 13 months of President Trump's presidency. Yet this question goes to the very founding of the Republic. I should also put this just in the context of the school. This is the second talk this semester that is part of the Foreign Policy and Global Security Department's security series. The next talk, let me give a quick plug, will take place on Tuesday, March 31st, 3:30 to 5. Another very timely topic titled Critical Minerals, China, coups, counterterrorism, and challenges in sub-Sahara Africa. You could see that the two topics, this one and the one in next month, there's more than perhaps a little overlap here. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to introduce our incredible panel. Then they will each speak for about 15 minutes. And then we will open it up to Q&A, okay, with a preference for questions from students. That does not exclude faculty, but priority will be given to students. Let me first introduce Steve Vladeck. Steve is, let me see if I can pronounce this correctly, Steve, the Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial. Good enough. I think that means 250 year.
150.
Or 150-year professor of federal courts at Georgetown Law School. You may have seen him on television.
I should say that's not my age.
You look great for whatever you are. You may have seen Steve on television because he's CNN's Supreme Court correspondent. He is also one of the most prolific law professors in the country. But also his articles, it's not just the quantity, it's the quality of his articles. He is the co-author of a leading casebook on national security law and counterterrorism. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Shadow Docket: How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. I like how he put the thesis in the title, because I always tell my students, when you read something, know what the thesis is. Steve made it very easy for you here. It's in the title, okay?
My wife made it to page 7.
Okay. Steve, though, is not just a teacher and a writer, researcher, intellect. He actually has argued, I don't know how many cases before the Supreme Court. 3 cases before the Supreme Court and many more before the Federal Court of Appeals, for the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. That, and other circuits too, I imagine, but mostly the DC Circuit rather, not the Federal Circuit. So welcome, Steve. Our second panelist is Ambassador retired Charlie Ray. If I were to go through all his accomplishments, we would not have much time left to speak. So I've just highlighted a few of them. Charlie, and he does go by Charlie, was in the U.S. Foreign Service for 30 years, retiring in 2012. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, he spent 20 years in the U.S. Army, retiring with the rank of Major. While he was in the Army, he served 2 tours in Vietnam, served in military intelligence, as well as special operations and public affairs. During his 30 years in the Foreign Service, he was posted to China, Thailand, Sierra Leone, Vietnam, and Cambodia and Zimbabwe. In fact, he served as ambassador to Cambodia and Zimbabwe. He also served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Sierra Leone and was the first U.S. Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City, as in Vietnam. From 2006 to 2009, Charlie served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW and Missing Personnel Affairs. Since his retirement from public service in 2012, he's been a full-time freelance writer, lecturer, and consultant, has done extensive research on international relations, leadership, and ethics, and he is the author of more than 300 books of fiction and nonfiction, many Westerns. Okay. This is a modern Renaissance man, clearly. One of his books, Ethical Dilemmas and the Practice of Diplomacy, addresses the gray area of conflicting values in the diplomatic service. He currently teaches 3 online graduate courses for Arizona State University. He's a member of the American Foreign Service Association, a fellow of the American College of National Security Leaders, a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy, a member of the board of the Cold War Museum, and a member of the Association of Black American Ambassadors. And this is just a small sampling of his accomplishments. I guess you don't sleep, Charlie. Finally, our own Josh Rovner, who is an associate professor here at SIS. He is, proud to say, a member of my department, the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security. His areas of expertise are intelligence, strategy, and foreign policy. He is the author of numerous books and articles. His books include Strategy and Grand Strategy, and he does, I was attending a talk you gave with a very interesting distinction between strategy and grand strategy. And he co-edited the book Chaos Reconsidered, The Liberal Order and the Future of International Politics, and also the author of Fixing the Facts, National Security and the Politics of Intelligence. With that, we are going to start with Steve, who will lay out maybe the framework, the legal framework and the constitutional framework when we consider what powers the president has and what limits are on the president's power when it comes to employing military force. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Ted. Not a tough job to do all of this in 15 minutes, but I'll try. So you started with the question of what are the sources of the president's power to use military force? This is the easiest question we will answer all day. There are 2 sources, the Constitution and statutes through which Congress has delegated that power to the president. That is not really in dispute. The fight is over how much the Constitution does, and the fight is over how much a whole bunch of statutes have done. So if we go all the way back to the founding, and I will not bore you with too much of the history, it's actually a bit of a myth that the Constitution was designed to reduce the power of the executive. In fact, the Constitution was a very centralizing document compared to the Articles of Confederation, the much weaker, looser confederacy that we had for the first 10, 12 years of the new republic. And indeed, that, as Chief Justice Marshall will put it somewhat sarcastically in a famous case called McCulloch versus Maryland, when it was decided that a plan for a more effective government was needed, we have the Constitution. That matters because one of the reasons why, one of the sort of last provocations of the Constitution was something called Shays' Rebellion, a very, very modest tax revolt in Western Massachusetts in late 1786 that the Articles of Confederation government was completely unable to deal with. And so having the ability to have a meaningful national military power for both external and internal threats was actually one of the immediate animating causes of the Constitutional Convention. So against that backdrop, the founders in the Constitution provided a whole bunch of provisions and powers relating to the military, but gave virtually all of them to Congress. It was Congress that was empowered to raise armies. It was Congress that was empowered to declare war. It was Congress that was given the power to provide for the calling forth of the militia during domestic emergencies, specifically to suppress insurrections, to repel invasions, or to otherwise execute the laws of the Union. And the only real power that the Constitution expressly gives to the president was the power to carry all of those laws into effect, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The Constitution also makes the president commander-in-chief of the military, but at least if you listen to Alexander Hamilton writing in The Federalist, that really was meant to be a superintendent's provision, guaranteeing civilian control of the military, not an independent substantive font of power. That original understanding is pretty well cemented. There obviously, we're law professors, so there's always someone who disagrees, but there is a pretty strong consensus that this was about how everyone understood the setup. And indeed, from the very early years of the Republic, Congress would authorize sometimes what the Supreme Court would call imperfect war, so less than full hostilities. This is true, for example, during the quasi-war with France at the very end of the 18th century and in 1800 itself. Congress would declare war, as it did during the War of 1812. Congress would fund the military through annual appropriations. Indeed, one of the only sunsets in the Constitution is the requirement that military appropriations be done on an annual basis. And presidents, for the most part, followed this model of carrying out statutory authority, of not making broad claims of executive power. This only really starts to shift a little bit during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln is armed with all kinds of arguments sounding a necessity, but radically in the 20th century, and especially during and after World War II. And what happened starting after World War II is the emergence of two different claims, two different types of claims of Article II power, of power on the part of the president. One is what we might call inherent power. So this is the idea that the president has the power to act even without affirmative statutory authorization, as long as Congress has been silent. And so the idea is that, listen, someone has to be able to act. The president should not have to wait for Congress to do something, at least for some military matters. Here's perhaps the best example. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, President Roosevelt should not have had to wait for Congress to declare war against Japan, to use military force against the attacking Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor. That idea that there's this sort of inherent defensive war power is first articulated by President Lincoln during the Civil War, but really becomes more prevalent into the 20th century. And of course, the idea of a defensive war power makes perfect sense in the abstract. The hard part is, where's the line between defense and offense? So if we take the Pearl Harbor example just a little bit further, did that mean President Roosevelt could shoot the planes down before they entered Hawaiian airspace? Did it mean that on December 6th, he could actually attack the Japanese aircraft carriers while they were in international water? Everyone agrees that there's a line before which it's not defense. But where's that line and who draws it started to become important questions as we saw presidents, especially after World War II, engage in ever more unilateral presidential war making. The second type of argument about executive power is one that really only comes into vogue later. President Nixon is the first to really make this aggressively, but it only comes out a couple of times during the Nixon administration. It really comes into vogue during the George W. Bush administration. And this is that the Constitution, in some respects, invests the president not just with inherent power, but with indefeasible or preclusive power, meaning the power to act even if Congress has specifically provided otherwise. And so we saw these arguments a lot, for example, after 9/11. President Bush and his lawyers made these arguments about, for example, the domestic statutory prohibitions on torture, some of the domestic prohibitions on certain types of surveillance. And so what all this led to was ever more aggressive claims by presidents, of both parties, although I think more aggressively historically by Republicans, that presidents didn't need Congress even for uses of military force. And so the real flashpoint for all of this actually ends up becoming Vietnam. So, without doing the whole history of Vietnam, the United States is already using a whole lot of military force in Vietnam before the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is enacted by Congress in 1964. Of course, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution then basically makes it open season. President Johnson uses very broad military force in and around Vietnam, but he also increasingly uses military force outside of Vietnam. President Nixon continues this. He bombs, among other places, Cambodia, without any real obvious congressional authorization. And this leads Congress in 1973 to pass a statute called the War Powers Resolution. I guess the shortest thing to say about the War Powers Resolution is there's a famous law professor named John Hart Ely who published a pair of articles, the title of which was "Suppose Congress Wanted a War Powers Resolution That Worked," because this one doesn't. But the basic premise of the War Powers Resolution was to try to rein in unilateral presidential war making by saying, hey, presidents, you can't act without telling us, first of all. Once you tell us, that starts a clock for 60 days. And if we haven't affirmatively authorized anything by the end of the 60 days, you are absolutely prohibited from continuing to engage in force. Well, presidents of both parties say, great, 60 free days. Right. And so a statute that was actually meant to rein in unilateral presidential war making has the perverse effect of not authorizing limited versions of it, but empowering arguments by the executive branch in support of that. So that's a big part of how we have sort of seen the war power drift. I want to add sort of two more points before turning this over to Charlie. Along the way, Congress has also passed other statutes that have been more specific authorizations. The modern term for this is AUMFs, authorizations for the use of military force. These are not declarations of war. We have not declared war since 1942. By the way, this is a really good trivia question. Does anyone know the last country against which the United States formally declared war? It wouldn't be a good trivia question if it was Germany. Yeah. That would also be too easy. This is why it's a good trivia question. It's Romania. So go home tonight and ask your friends, like, hey, do you know the last country we declared war against? It was Romania. We haven't declared war since 1942. Instead, we passed these more limited statutes. But how limited are they? So the one that is perhaps causing the most mischief these days is a statute Congress passed on September 18th, 2001, 1 week after 9/11, called just the AUMF, the Authorization to Use Military Force. In that statute, Congress authorized the president to use, quote, all necessary and appropriate force against those persons, organizations, or nations he determines were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. So it's not, as it's often portrayed, a declaration of war against terrorism, but it is a very broad delegation to the president of the power to use military force against groups he says are responsible for or connected to those who are responsible for 9/11. We've used that statute to engage in military force at last count in 22 different countries. And against a whole bunch of groups that are not al-Qaeda. Congress has not repealed that statute. There has been effort to repeal it. It has never gotten off the ground. And of course, note that even if Congress were to repeal it, you would need a president who is willing to sign the repeal, or you would need a veto-proof supermajority in both chambers. I'm not sure we could get a veto-proof supermajority to agree that tomorrow is Thursday. So one problem is that we have these old AUMFs that are still on the books. The Iraq AUMF from 2002 is still on the books, and presidents have used that expansively. But the bigger problem, and I think this is what brings us to the moment we're in, is that historically, the real check on excessive unilateral presidential war making was political pressure and political pushback and political blowback. Not that presidents would be dragged into court over uses of military force, but that they would suffer political consequences, both directly in Congress and indirectly at the polls. And that has just not been true now for a generation. There's no evidence that uses of military force since the Iraq War, which had its own statute, have provoked the kind of outrage, pushback, congressional interest that historically we saw. President Trump's use of whether it's drones or other kinetic force to blow up all of these drug boats in the Eastern Caribbean and the Southeast and the Eastern Pacific. One would think that would have been a bigger scandal and something Congress would push back against more. When Rand Paul is right about something, that should, make us all a little bit nervous. And yet here we are. So part of the problem that we're facing today is that Congress has not just abandoned its authority formally, Congress has also abandoned its informal ability to check executive branch uses of military force through the political process. And I know you guys will talk more about the politics of this. Just one last thought, and then I'll stop. We've been focusing so far on foreign and international uses of the military. I think I'd be remiss in not saying a quick word about domestic use of the military, because that is also something we are dealing with here in 2026. There's at least some consensus that just about everything has to be authorized by statute. But the relevant statute, again, is an old statute called the Insurrection Act that gives the president a remarkably broad amount of power, where historically the checks have not been that the statute is narrow. The checks have been that it was politically unthinkable that presidents would use that statute in circumstances that didn't obviously demand it. We are living right now in the longest period in American history without a domestic invocation of the Insurrection Act. The last one was in May of 1992 in response to the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. But I think that's maybe just a matter of time. And so, the broader point here is that the legal regime has become incredibly soft and manipulable and deferential, partly because presidents have claimed ever more power and partly because Congress has asserted ever less of its institutional authority. And so when we see, for example, President Trump sending troops into Venezuela to basically kidnap President Maduro, what was the legal theory behind that argument? Well, the legal theory behind that operation was that there was an arrest warrant out against Maduro. FBI agents are allowed to enforce arrest warrants overseas, by the way, apparently even when it's a violation of the other country's sovereignty. And we needed to send in the troops to protect the FBI agents. That kind of bootstrapping is where we are. And I think the founders, if they were aware of this, would be rolling over in their graves. So it's a political problem, it's a constitutional problem, it's an institutional problem. And unfortunately, although it's been especially exacerbated over the last 13 months by President Trump, it's actually one that's been building for the better part of 40 years. So on that happy and uplifting note, I will stop and turn it over to Charlie.
Thank you, Steve. You've reminded me why constitutional law was not only my favorite course in law school, but my favorite course of everything I've studied. Well, that's what makes it interesting, right? You can argue about it. And those of you who know me, I love to argue. Anyway, let's, Charlie, we're eager to hear your thoughts on these issues.
After that, I'm almost afraid to say anything, because I would sort of like to address it from the standpoint of the military people who have to carry out the president's orders to do whatever, wherever, to whomever, and how confusing that is. And I think the point's really been made very well, that there are a lot of laws and restrictions. A very good example is the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the use of the military to enforce domestic laws, except in very, very limited circumstances. And that is one that the Insurrection Act trumps. And if you're wearing a uniform these days, I really feel sorry for everyone in uniform trying to decide if this act that you're being ordered to do is legal or not legal, moral or immoral, it requires the wisdom of Solomon. I mean, going all the way back to George Washington rebuking his officers in the Continental Army who were on the verge of revolt because they weren't being paid. The civilian control of the military is one of the traditions that so far has not been violated. Of all of the issues that we discussed that things are going off the rails, there's not been a question yet that the military is under civilian control. But what question that does come up though is what is the, not so much what the power of the president is, but what is the option available to people in uniform when the civilian authority decides to ignore the law? I mean, what is the option for a military person if the president gives an illegal order? And I'm sort of reminded of two things. One is the David Frost interview with Nixon when Nixon said, if the president does it, it's legal, which is buttressed, unfortunately, by the recent Supreme Court ruling that presumes that the president, if he's acting in his official capacity, is immune from any type of prosecution. The problem with that is that there's nothing in any of that that says the people who carry out these illegal orders are immune. And so the question that I've been wrestling with in a lot of the writing that I've been doing lately is, what are the limits of the civilian control of the military when the orders coming from the top are not in accords with the law? I mean, basically, what is the military to do when receiving an illegal order? And it really if you think constitutional law is complicated, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or the UCMJ, as it operates in the military environment, is really confusing. Because on the one hand, the Uniform Code of Military Justice says quite specifically that the military is not allowed to obey an illegal order, a patently, manifestly illegal act. If you obey it, you are legally liable. On the other hand, the military has that same Uniform Code of Military Justice has provisions that says the military must comply with orders given by the legally elected civilian authority. And it's trying to deconflict those two. I think that's an issue that we could very well be facing in a very short period of time. I look at, for example, you mentioned these boat strikes in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. The one that gets my attention is that I think it was the first operation when they struck the boat. It didn't sink. They blew it up, but it didn't sink. There were two people hanging to the wreckage, and they called in a second strike and took them out. The problem with that is that in the law of land warfare, or in the laws of warfare that guides the military in determining when operations are legal or not, that is one of the specifically enumerated no-nos. You do not fire on even armed enemy. You do not fire on them when they can no longer fight back. It is just absolutely no argument that that's an illegal act. And there was a lot of argument over whether these were orders that came from the White House or whether this was a decision made by the flag rank commander on scene. It will probably never really be sorted out, but I think we will see more and more of these issues as time goes by. Domestic use of the military is another issue that I think has to be looked at. If the president declares insurrection and invokes the Insurrection Act based on a whim, what is the liability of the military people that he orders to go into an American city to restore order when I don't know if you could call what happened in Minneapolis an insurrection. I watched with interest what was happening in Oregon, which reminded me of the movie The Mouse That Roared. There wasn't really much in the way of legitimate fighting back unless you call someone in a frog costume making fun of people an insurrection. And so what we're faced with is an issue of should the military be put into a position of having to say no to the president, who is under the Constitution the commander in chief, and where are the guardrails that help the military to decide whether an action that they're being told to do is legal or illegal. And the other is, what is the military to do when the action they're being ordered to do is legal, but it's immoral or stupid? And having spent 20 years in uniform, I can tell you, stupid orders come down more often than people realize. Not always from the civilian chain of command, but frequently. And in today's environment, that is an issue that could create a heck of a dilemma for the military to cope with. And I could go on, but I think it would probably be better to listen to our third speaker and then answer any questions that people have. But I would leave people with this question to consider. Should the military be put into a position where military officers have to say no to the president? And what impact would that have on the tradition of civilian control of the military? And with that, I will stop talking.
Great. Well, so we've heard about the erosion of external constraints on presidential war-making powers from Steve. We've heard about the erosion of internal constraints on presidential authority from Charlie. I guess I'll raise the issue of consequences, like, so what, right? So President Trump is not the first president to want to be unfettered, right? I think probably every president would like it if Congress did not act as an inhibitor, if the courts did not serve as a constraint. Right? I think every president down deep really likes Alexander Hamilton's idea of an energetic executive, like free to act on the world stage without being hemmed in, right? The problem is that an unfettered executive can do a lot of harm, right? And we're facing that problem these days. Our concerns about an unfettered, uninhibited president are at the forefront. So what's going to happen in the next few years, right? Well, I don't know, but I'll give you a couple of things that you might want to look for. So to start with Trump's vision, as far as I can understand it, of how to conduct foreign policy and his general vision for how international politics works. Trump really, really loves flexibility. He really, really loves ambiguity, right? So he likes the ability to make deals and break deals. He likes the ability to pivot between friends and adversaries. And he likes the ability to keep people in the dark about his underlying intentions, like, what are we going to do next? It's not accidental that there's an enormous flotilla around Iran today, and people don't exactly know what it's there for. This is not unusual. Like, Trump likes this. And the reason that he likes this, he's not shy about it, is that he views international politics a lot like he views business, where you get bargaining leverage by being nimble. You gain bargaining advantage by keeping your bargaining counterparts somewhat in the dark about your real bottom line. So he likes flexibility and ambiguity, and ultimately, like other presidents, he wants freedom of action. Right? Freedom of action is really, really important. does not want to be constrained. He lashes out whenever he is constrained, right? As was the case in the Supreme Court's tariff decision a few days ago. He got really angry about that. Right? What everyone thinks about this approach to international affairs, there's a certain logic to it. Sometimes we don't want to admit this, but there is a certain logic to this idea that flexibility and ambiguity can give you leverage in some situations. The problem is, or one problem, is that it has potentially really severe consequences for national security institutions, right? If you are the president and you want maximum ambiguity and flexibility, it's very hard to issue clear marching orders to the institutions you lead, right? A bureaucracy needs direction. And what are the armed forces, after all, but a large armed bureaucracy? So if you like to conceive of grand strategy and foreign policy in terms of deal making, right? Well, that might be fine, but it erodes institutional capabilities. It's hard to get national security agencies, military forces, intelligence agencies, and so forth on the same page if they don't have clear direction. Processes become vague. Guidelines become changeable. Direction becomes a negotiation. Right? Another problem at the institutional level is that it's hard to encourage professionalism under these circumstances. Right? If there is a disregard for norms and constraints at the highest level, it's hard to enforce them at lower levels. Right? Professionalism is both taught to national security professionals, but it's reinforced over time and routinely, right? So continuing that tradition of professionalism and educating one another in professional settings will be harder and harder the longer this goes on. So both in terms of bureaucratic process and bureaucratic professionalism, this desire for ambiguity and flexibility can have real meaningful consequences, right? But I'm talking abstractly here. What are some real consequences, right, today? Well, one is that the military might become less effective, right? The military might become a lot less effective. There's very, very good research on what happens as regimes tend towards authoritarianism. And the basic story is that they become less effective on the battlefield. Right? Authoritarian leaders tend to build armies around them. They promote based on loyalty rather than merit. They discourage military officers from communicating without going through them first. Right? And they otherwise act in ways that tightens their grip over the armed forces, but makes those armed forces less lethal. This is quite ironic because the DoD is supposed to all be about lethality these days, right? If you listen to Secretary Hegseth, that's the goal. We should become more lethal. I think the military is going to become less lethal the longer this goes on. The professional use of military force will suffer the longer this continues, right? That said, Trump's making a bet. And his bet is that he will not have to use the military for long periods of time. Trump likes airstrikes. Trump likes drone strikes. Trump loves special forces raids, right? He likes the pinpoint application of force. He does not like long military occupations. He does not like ground occupations and ground invasions. He wants to use military force rapidly and then be done with it. We've seen this in both his first administration and in the first year of this administration as well. And the bet that Trump seems to be making is that if we can use violence in short, sharp blows, then we won't have to worry about these issues of bureaucratic process and professionalism and all that other boring stuff that I mentioned before, right? Just send in the airplanes, send in the strikes, send in special forces, conduct a raid, and declare victory, right? Well, maybe that works out, right? Maybe that's exactly what happens over the last 3 years. In a sense, that's what happened in the first administration. There were big concerns, if you recall, that the United States would get bogged down in a new war, say against North Korea or Iran the first time around, but it didn't happen. Okay? It might be where it doesn't happen this time as well. But the next 3 years are a lot like the last 5 years of Trump's presidency. Right? That we see lots of counter-terrorist airstrikes, and we see lots of one-off raids and bombing strikes against nuclear targets, but we don't see large-scale, sustained military operations against any particular country. I think that's probably what the White House wants, because that would have the effect of letting Trump do more of what he wants without anybody getting in the way and without any of the political pushback that would come in the instance of a long, protracted war.
Well, thank you all. You've given us a lot to think about, and a lot basis for some hopefully really good questions. So please, if you have a question, get online behind the microphone. Let me emphasize questions, unlike Senate hearings, which are 9-minute statements and a 10-second question. Yes, you can lay the foundation for your question, but make it a question.
Hi, I'm Diego Redondo, and this is my question for Mr. Charlie. Having 20 years being in the United States Army, what would you do personally if you got a legal order? Would you follow it and hopefully not get martial order? Would you challenge it, or would you just deny it 100%?
That's a good question. And fortunately, I'm not in the Army anymore, so I can give you a blunt answer. I don't think an active duty person would be able to answer that easily. But if I received an order that I knew was illegal, then I would say no and deal with the consequences, because the consequences in a not a perfect world, but in the world the way it's supposed to work, is that if you receive an order that you know is illegal and you carry it out, you can be court-martialed, and that's just, I mean, that's in black and white in the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Okay, thank you so much.
And just to add, many people in that situation are 18 or 19 years old, and you're asking them to make very quick decisions, facing maybe with unit cohesion and loyalty to your unit on one hand, and then you're asking them to somehow maybe interpret the legality of an order. That's asking a lot of your soldiers.
So my question, my name is George, and my question is for you, Mr. Charlie, as well. You talked about how the military has rejected sometimes the declaration requests coming from the commander of chief. Why was there a particular specific reason why they rejected that request, and when that was?
No, I didn't say that the military has rejected. I said that we are approaching a situation where we are asking, considering whether the military would reject. Just from a military standpoint, and this is getting into the sausage factory. During my 30 years in the military, what I saw when I served in some high-level staff positions, when orders came from the Secretary of Defense or from the White House that were not illegal, but were a little hinky, or just stupid, there are bureaucratic ways to not obey the order without disobeying the order. And this is I'm not sure something that would work with this current administration, with their demands for absolute loyalty. But in the past, if an order came down that was not too smart, the way it was not obeyed was that the commander, and this is done at a high level. We're not talking about a troop on the ground. would go back with a request for clarification or with an alternative proposal. You know, there are bureaucratic ways that in the past have worked to get around this problem of orders that are not quite kosher. I don't remember in the 20 years that I was in the military, other than the situation that happened in the 60s with the military becoming involved with this operation that the FBI had called COINTELPRO, which was doing spying on members of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, which was a definite no-no that the military got involved in. And but other than that, the issues that I remember facing were not so much illegal orders, but orders to do things that basically either would be counterproductive and cause more problems than they solved. And that's where you rely on your senior military people, the colonels and the generals, to be able to go into a room with the civilian leadership and talk them around to a more sensible way of doing things. I'm not sure, though, given the firings and retirements and transfers that have taken place since last January, that's something that will work very well in the current environment.
Thank you so much. And I have another kind of follow-up question with that as well.
I was going to say something about military lawyers, because I think part of what Charlie's getting at. So each service branch of the military has a judge advocate general who is the head uniformed officer lawyer for that service branch. And actually, this I think is not a well-known fact, but since about 2000, Charlie might know the date, but I think it's 2004, 2005, by law, the JAGs are required to provide, quote, independent legal advice, unquote, to the Secretary of Defense, to the senior leadership at the department, to the senior combatant commanders as well. One of the first things that Secretary Hegseth did after he was confirmed last February is he fired all the JAGs. Not the lawyers in the JAG court, but the JAGs, the T-JAGs, and installed people who, were not them. And I think that's, part of the problem here is that when Charlie talks about the culture within the military of running things up the chain of command, of asking questions, of having even lawyers, whether it was the TJAG or the staff judge advocate assigned to the unit. There's a great post on executive functions. This is a Substack newsletter written by Jack Goldsmith and Bob Bauer, where Jack wrote, I think just last week, about the declining commitment to the rule of law inside the military. And I think that's a big part of the problem that Charlie's speaking to.
Yeah,
one other thing I'd like to add too, by the way, is in addition to the changes that the Secretary of Defense made to the senior JAG, a lot of the lower level, the sort of unit level JAG officers have been pulled out and reassigned to immigration courts, which has deprived a lot of the commanders of that on-site legal advice that they could really depend on in the past.
Thank you so much, both. I had a follow-up kind of question about that as well. So if Congress and the Commander-in-Chief have agreed to the declaration of war, can the military reject that declaration? And if yes, what happens?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no. If Congress declares war, the military goes to war. That's just the way it works. And any senior officer who says no, it will be a civilian in short order.
Just one other sort of small data point, because I think this is tied to all of this. I don't know if you guys have seen the news about how the government's now using a whole bunch of line JAG attorneys, the sort of the lower level JAG lawyers, as special assistant U.S. attorneys in Minneapolis and elsewhere in all these immigration cases. There's a very simple reason. I mean, the need for that is manpower, but the reason why the government is relying on the JAGs is because, unlike civilian lawyers in the Department of Justice who can refuse to take on a particular case, the JAG lawyers can't. And not only can they not, but were they to refuse, they would not just be taken off the case, they would be drummed out of the military, which is, I think, another sort of way in which we've blurred some pretty long-standing lines between civilian and military. Sorry, I've been rambling.
No, that was good. Thank you. Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for today's presentation. I'm Dr. Elaine Soreo. I'm Associate Rector of UACU, a private Ukrainian university still operating throughout the war. And I have two questions, one linked to the other. First, looking specifically at what's taken place where Senator Kelly and others have addressed as retired military to younger military regarding taking illegal orders and how that this Secretary Heges has gone after him. He has been rebuffed legally, and now he's going after him again. And what this states to anyone trying to go out, because as we see, again, also linking it to Trump and the Supreme Court telling Trump that he can't, go ahead with what he's doing and with regard to tariffs, and Trump turning around saying, yeah, well, just watch me, and then proceeding to say 10 and then 15%, and he's just going to go on, and it's just this back and forth. So it's a total disrespect of the government for anybody who brings forth a legal position. And then secondly, with regard to Ukraine, again, the total disregard for our commitments as we have made in the past to countries, not just Ukraine, but many other countries, and the current situation where the Constitution, as I understand it, of Ukraine, is that there can only be giving up land if the people of Ukraine vote to give up their land. And then it goes before the Rada and such. So can you comment on those connections? Thank you.
Well, on the issue of civil-military relations, the first question, and Senator Kelly and Secretary Hegseth, we're in a very peculiar moment right now. Civil-military relations are always tricky, like they always have been. This is something that we've wrestled with really from the start, right? And the fundamental question of civil-military relations is, who guards the guardians, right? We equip very large forces with lots and lots of firepower, but then we demand that they are subordinate to civilian authority, right? And that is a kind of bedrock principle of American civil-military relations, but it's under strain. And there is a danger that we will be looking for military champions to push back against the Trump administration. And I understand that feeling, that you want people, retired military like Senator Kelly, or even sort of active duty, to like stand up to him and like reinforce the tradition. But there's a slippery slope here. There really is a danger of the United States putting too much faith in its military to solve what is essentially a political problem. That we're leaning on the military to solve this. And in a sense, this is the culmination of decades of Americans increasingly asking the military to do more and more and more. both in terms of foreign policy and now to sort of rescue the body politic here at home. So in terms of the immediate sort of back and forth between Hegseth and Kelly, I think Secretary Hegseth is completely wrong about this. I think he probably knows he's wrong on the merits, but this is a little bit of political theater. But I do worry when I hear criticism of the administration from some of my friends and colleagues that say, oh, well, we wish the people in uniform would just stand up to him. Like, I don't want to push that too far.
I'll say on the broader question, I mean, I don't know. I think that the more I look at this administration is not lawless. This administration is committed to twisting the law into a pretzel, and those are not the same thing. And so, you know, it's one thing for the president to say, okay, I wasn't able to use this statute to do my tariffs. I'm going to try to use a different statute. That's kosher. I mean, that's what President Biden did with student loans. It's what other presidents have done when they've had other losses in court. I think the larger problem is that in the context of the conversation we're having this afternoon, you know, military force is an area that is notorious historically for not having bright legal lines. And when you have an administration that's not going to over-enforce the law, that is going to see every legal constraint as an opportunity to move, to act right up to the constraint, the fact that we have blurrier lines when it comes to the limits of the president's power to use force, to do all this stuff, is indeed, as Josh, I mean, it's an invitation. In a way that it wouldn't be domestically. And so I think the real sort of original sin here is Congress spending the better part of 75 years just not putting in any more robust constraints on unilateral presidential war making on the theory that political checks would do it. And unlike having the military save us from our politics, I actually think the law can save us from some of our politics. You need the politics to align first to actually have the law. And we don't at the moment.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, and I don't want to get too far from the subject of the topic for today's talk, but to rein in an executive branch that is pushing boundaries, I'm using that phrase diplomatically, the judges are going to have to step in. They've been reluctant to do so, often say this is a political dispute between Congress and the executive branch. But for instance, apparently, I read yesterday that Hegseth is planning to appeal the court order that had dismissed the case.
He already did.
I'm sorry?
He appealed. He did.
Yeah, so he did appeal it. I want to know, and where was that case brought against Senator Kelly? You're going to need judges starting to hold, and I was a trial attorney with the Justice Department for 10 years, holding the government in contempt for, let's say, a frivolous lawsuit. I mean, that lawsuit or prosecution, I guess a lawsuit, civil suit against Kelly, that's a textbook definition of a frivolous case. And until judges start threatening or actually imposing sanctions on government lawyers, we're not going to make a lot of progress. And maybe maybe the trial judges were waiting for a signal from the Supreme Court, and maybe the tariff decision is in part that signal.
To underscore your point.
I want to get to we have three people behind you.
Just to say, there are a lot of retired senior naval officers that I know personally, rear admirals and such, and they are very concerned because of what's taking place. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Evan Miller. I'm a second-year graduate student here at SIS. Talked about how there are two interpretations of presidential power, the inherent powers of the presidency and the preclusive powers of the presidency. And the war powers resolution kind of had the opposite effect in where it gave a lot more preclusive powers to the president. Talked about how a lot of stuff with Nixon in Vietnam, bombing Cambodia, and Donald Trump also seems to favor this type of action where it's quick and it's not sustained, doesn't need like large legal challenges. What are some legal mechanisms that Congress can pursue to limit the preclusive powers of the president? Thank you.
Well, I mean, if they're really preclusive, Congress can't. But the Supreme Court has never actually suggested that the president's powers over the military and the president's power to use military force are preclusive. So, Congress could pass a much more robust war powers resolution, for example, a statute that says you may not use military force in the following circumstances unless we have authorized it. Right? Congress could pass a statute that, sort of occupies the field, as the lawyers would say, in defining the circumstances in which the president's allowed to use the military. You could have maybe an emergency exception that said, all right, in a true emergency, you can do it for 48 hours, but if you're wrong, we're going to impeach you. There are lots of things Congress could do to put much tighter reins on executive uses of military force. There's just never been a political appetite for it. And, I think perhaps the best example of this, the 2002 Iraq AUMF is still on the books, right? Why hasn't Congress repealed a 24-year-old AUMF against a country that, the country still exists, but not in the form of the government that the AUMF was designed to, topple. So, if the question is what can Congress do? Quite a lot. The harder question is, why won't Congress ever assert itself institutionally when it comes to the war powers? And I think today the short answer is because Congress doesn't assert itself institutionally about anything, that we live in a time of the separation of parties, not the separation of powers. But honestly, Congress's abdication of the war powers began long before our contemporary polarization, and long before the current obstacles to meaningful institutional reform. And I think it was because, it's a lot easier for Congress to sort of hold its nose and write a check and not be responsible for sending troops into harm's way than for Congress to own it. And I think we have to change that incentive structure.
Hi, I'm Brad. I'm a student here at SIS. So we talked a lot about the history of the United States, how we got here, and that's kind of the basis of my question is, so as we've, over our history, have shifted war powers to the president, would you guys agree with the notion that it's human nature or it's rational to push war powers to a single person in times of crisis because they can act swiftly and obviously take action faster than Congress could? So would you agree with that? And if so, can we ever shift it back to Congress?
And so I think it's a very good question because this history goes all the way back to the start, and even in the very early republic, right, presidents were quite active with the use of force, right? And we don't think about these as being sort of traditional wars, but we were expanding westward. And a lot of westward expansion was done overtly, but also covertly by presidents who were very enthusiastic about skirting Congress in order to do what they thought was necessary against indigenous tribes. And they killed a lot of people along the way, right? So presidents have always grasped the ability to act independent of congressional oversight with the use of force. This goes back, 250 years now. Why is this a trend? What explains this pattern? Well, part of it, I think, is, as you say, after an attack, there is a rally around the flag phenomenon. So you do have cases like 9/11, for those of us who were here for that, right, where people absolutely rallied around the flag and rallied around George W. Bush. Like a 91% approval rating, sky high. It was basically carte blanche. Do whatever you need to do to take care of this problem, right? So I think there is some emotional, instinctual response to attack on behalf of sort of ordinary people. There's also an organizational desire for leadership in those moments, right? Somebody just take charge. Somebody do it. Right? We can't have a committee. There's no such thing as a collective leadership. There needs to be a leader, right? And within the White House, presidents they're usually pretty ambitious, self-confident people, right? So you don't rise to that level and take all the slings and arrows of being a professional politician unless you got a pretty big ego and you want to take over in those moments. The real question that we're grappling with now is we're not under threat, right? This is not a 9/11 moment. The United States is extraordinarily secure, world historically secure. And yet you're seeing the same move to concentrate power around one person. And the fact that this is going on and seems to be accelerating is what is so both perplexing and frustrating to critics.
Yeah, I just don't think future president will ever just want to give up those powers.
But I mean, we've both quoted Hamilton, right? Madison, I think, had some stuff to say about this too, right? Like the founders were not oblivious to the idea that presidents would be ambitious. If anything, right, they wanted presidents to be ambitious, right? The founders just thought that the way that you rein in the ambitions of a president is with ambitious other branches. Right, Madison in Federalist 51 says ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and so I think it is a fool's errand to think that we will ever elect a president who doesn't want to have presidential power. Jimmy Carter notwithstanding, I think that model is not likely to get through a primary anytime soon, and that's okay. Right, like the problem is not presidential power. The problem is congressional fecklessness, and I think that's, if we're thinking about how to solve this, I want an energetic executive. I just want an energetic Congress too.
What about an energetic judiciary? Do you think they've been abdicating their role?
I don't.
Could I add something?
The last thing I would say about the Supreme Court is that it has been abdicating its role. It is quite energetic. It's just its energy is chaotic.
I'd like to add something here. The question of whether it's good to have a single person making the decision. I'd like to point out that, yeah, it's good to have a single person making the decision in a tactical, wartime situation. But if you look at all of our wars, let's take Eisenhower at D-Day. He made the decision, but he made it only after getting sage advice from a lot of competent staff officers and considering a lot of pluses and minuses before finally taking the responsibility of making the ultimate decision. When you have a situation, though, like you have now, where the person making the decision listens to no one or everyone, or in the middle of the night gets an idea and insists it gets carried out, that's chaos. That's not efficient. That is not efficient leadership.
And just one other thing on thinking ahead and what might stop the trend or slow down the trend at least. This is not an overnight fix. This is a generational issue that we're going to face, and there's not going to be a moment in which we say, "Oh, hallelujah, the court stood up and restored order," or Congress found its backbone, or something like that happens, and everything is going to snap back to normal. It's just not that way. What this will take, I think, is a huge amount of civic education for young people who are learning their government, learning their institutions, and learning their laws, but also people like y'all, God bless you, who have come to a policy school to learn things and who are devoted to trying to do your best to bring professionalism back and to do the right thing, right? And so it's going to take a generation of motivated people who are willing to do the work. And believe me, it's work. And there's also just going to have to be a lot of political on the ground work. People have to organize, people have to campaign, people have to run for office, and people have to vote, right? Because as I said earlier, ultimately, this is a political issue more than any other.
So, thank you, guys.
All right. Hi, my name is Catherine. I guess these both kind of go out to all of you guys, but it's kind of a two-parter. So my first thing is, do you all think that there have been any like tangible foreign policy or national security advantages that have kind of come from the expansion of executive war-making powers? And then kind of to your point about future consequences for like professionalism and how it's going to change kind of the military. Do you think that it's like feasible to maintain our military or international interests, whatever that, may kind of come to mean over the next 3 years, through more limited strikes, or do you kind of foresee that maybe potentially weakening the US's position internationally?
So a fantastic question. I'll take a crack at the first one. Has any good come out of the concentration of presidential power? Yeah, I think there has been, and I think that if we're going to have an honest conversation, we have to be able to view both sides of this. So I'll give two examples of things that I think we've done well in terms of national security. One is, might not be popular at all, but I think that the use of covert action has had important benefits for international security since World War II. Covert action has been done stupidly and has been done in some cases with terrible consequences, but in other cases has been an important check on escalation. So during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were in intense competition, and had it gone all the way up to armed warfare, might have been curtains for everyone, right? We wouldn't be talking here, right? Covert action proved to be a release valve, and both sides knew that they were doing it. It wasn't really covert. Like, we knew what Moscow was up to, Moscow knew what we were up to. And this became a way, sometimes a rather grim way, in which the two superpowers were competing against each other without going to war. Right? Now, this would not have been possible without a great deal of presidential authority to act. Right? And this is a trade-off. So in that sense, I think it was a good thing. Now, not every covert action was a good thing, but I think not going to war was a good thing. The other more recent one, again, you might disagree with me, but I think a lot of counterterrorism since 9/11 has been successful, right? Like if you had asked most people on September 12th, would be around 25 years later without having a similarly spectacular and horrifying attack, you would have said, no, we were all waiting for the next one. Right? But the United States and successive presidents, armed with extraordinary authorities to act independently, have become really good at counterterrorism, right? In terms of just discovering networks of people and manhunting. Now, is this a solution to terrorism? Of course it's not. Is this a war in the traditional sense? Not at all. It's more like policing. But against groups like Al-Qaeda, it has proven pretty effective, at least at keeping the security threat in moderation, right? So there's at least two cases in which there has been benefit from it, but there's a danger that we could go too far.
Charlie, do you want to say anything on this matter?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree that the covert action has been one of the positive things that's come out of, say, the last 20 or 30 years. But I would point out that the most effective covert actions have been the ones that not everybody knows about. And what I see happening now is, what bothers me is that everything's being done to coincide with the news cycle. It's being done through social media posts. And when you broadcast everything that you're doing, the problem that you have to take into account is not every operation that you do that way is going to be one of those quick in, quick outs, because the other guy gets a vote in it too. And there's always, right now, for example, I'm working on a project with some people on this U.S. deployment of troops to Nigeria in this, quote, war to protect the Nigerian Christians, which is already creating some friction in Nigeria, because the government, well, first of all, because most of the violence there has been directed at some of the Muslim areas rather than Christian areas, and there's a resentment when the U.S. deployment is, quote, aimed at only those people, protecting Christians. And it's been so publicized. I mean, that the drone strike on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day that generated headlines and announcements has really not gone down well in parts of West Africa. So my point there is, we sometimes our success is our failure. We take it for granted that we'll be able to do this again and again, and it really behooves us to have someone who's taking into account what the reaction on the other side's going to be when we do one of these things. I think the short-term gain, this transactional short-term gain approach, has some real disastrous consequences down the road. I mean, we're looking at a generation of ill will and mistrust that we're creating in places that will hurt us in other areas that we aren't thinking about when we focus on this make a deal and done is not a way to run foreign policy or military operations for that matter. You need someone who considers the second and third order effects of an operation before you launch it and then publicize it throughout the world. That's just not the way to do it.
And then
I have a very quick question because there are 3 people behind you. But thank you, Catherine. One of my best students.
So Catherine also asked about sort of the foreign policy implications moving forward. Sorry, Piper Campbell. Catherine asked about the foreign policy implications, possible foreign policy implications moving forward of some of these approaches that we're seeing right now. And Ambassador Ray, I happen to know that you dealt with, let's say, executive overreach in some of the countries in which you've served. I'm thinking Cambodia, especially attempted coups while you were there, Zimbabwe. But I wonder if I can challenge any of the 3, but especially Ambassador Ray, to kind of both speak to what this kind of, what you've seen in other countries when the branch has perhaps used and abused the military, and what are some of the implications that you've seen of that, but also more broadly, thoughts from any of the 3 of you about how doing diplomacy with some of the dynamics that we're discussing, some of the complications that come from that.
Well, I just say something quickly and then let the others speak. The best example that I can give of executive overreach and misuse of the military that backfired would be Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. From 1980 until 2017, when he was overthrown, he politicized the Zimbabwean military and used it as an instrument of staying in power, of oppressing the opposition and of keeping the population under control. And that same military, when they felt that his actions were jeopardizing their corrupt schemes and their ability to make money and their positions, removed him from power. And that's something that I think is typical when in an authoritarian. I think someone said earlier that one of the problems that happens is that you deprofessionalize the military. When you do that, you're creating it's like training an attack dog. You've got to be careful that one day you don't fall asleep and your attack dog decides to use you as a snack.
I'm Boaz Attilia, professor here. So my question is about the checks and balances, and we talked about the judicial checks and balances, how these are not really functioning right now. The congressional checks and balances, the legislature, and how this doesn't function in terms of war powers for a long time, but maybe even more so right now. I want to ask you guys about a third kind of more hidden check and balances that you might call a bureaucratic check and balances. And that's the systems that around the decision making, for example, in the State Department or National Security Council, that are not checks and balances in the kind of common sense that they have the power to stop presidential action, but there always been sort of like a way to get more thought into the presidential action, to get more nuance, to get analysis into the presidential action and nowadays these conveyor belts are kind of completely hollowed out in some sense. How much does this affect the danger in a president that can decide whatever they want about going to war or not? Thanks.
I think this is one of the big differences between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Yeah. So Trump 1 had the so-called adults in the room, right, who were sort of foreign policy traditionalists, people like Secretary Mattis and others, who were seen as people who could restrain Trump's instincts, right, and sort of keep him a little more mainstream than he otherwise would have been. So you did have some of that in Trump 1, and I think that Trump in the first term, I think he was still a novice politically. He's got very strong political instincts, but in terms of how to govern, he was very much a novice, right? And so I think that he was somewhat deterred by their presence, and he felt that he had to at least pay lip service to the sort of well-known traditionalist in his own cabinet and within the NSC. That's gone today. Like he's in this administration. The cabinet meetings are they're a parade of people praising Trump. It's a loyalism on display. And I think that Trump has figured out that he doesn't, in fact, need to appease anybody around him. He will do what he wants. He has a very robust political base, which remains, it's not huge, but it's the strongest political base in American politics, and he's going to go with it to the end. So it used to be where there were these sort of internal constraints, normative, informal constraints on presidents by virtue of well-known, charismatic, highly respected insiders. Those just don't exist right now, as far as I can tell.
Steve, Charlie? Anything?
No, I would agree. I mean, and I see it at the State Department. The advisory role, or the senior people who advise the secretary, don't exist anymore. More and more, I'm seeing people at the Pentagon who could be sage advisors being reassigned, retired, or kicked out. So the internal mechanisms don't exist, and as has been said already, it's really going to be left up to the courts, and I'd like to say the Congress, but I tend to agree with what was said. The Congress is just basically retired in place.
Just to the White House and DOD and state, I would add the Justice Department, which is, I mean, not that, from experience, but which historically was quite a speed break on some of the more lawless impulses of presidents, and I think has become, openly admits that it sees its job as being the president's lawyers in a way that was never, ever, ever true.
Now, let me just add, when I was at Justice, I never saw anything. Yes, I wasn't at the very top. I was a trial attorney, but I never saw anything or even approached the gray ethically. If anything, we erred too much on the side of caution. And let me just add one other thing. A few months ago, Cass Sunstein, a Harvard law professor, was giving a talk on one of his books, which come out about every 3 months. But he talked about after law school, he clerked for the Supreme Court, and then he worked for the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department, which is kind of the main thinking shop. It's like what the policy planning staff is at state. Office of Legal Counsel is at Justice. And he was there during the Reagan administration. He wasn't a political appointee, but he'd say we'd often get, requests from the White House, maybe the White House counsel, look into whether the president has authority to do X, Y, Z. Look at the statute or whatever. Can we do what the president would like to do? And he said often we'd look and we'd try and find it, and often we'd say, we've looked at this carefully, the statute, blah, blah, blah. No, the president can't do this. And Reagan, who believed in expansive executive authority, said, okay, then let's go back and see if there's another statute I could use. But that was the norm. And I think a lot of people don't realize how norm busting the past 13 months have been, and even maybe, first term, but also the centralization of power in the White House that goes back several administrations now, where I think now many, DOD, the State Department, Justice are seen as implementers of policy developed by OMB or the National Security Council, not where ideas or policies percolate up. No, the ideas come from the White House, and then White House tells the executive main agencies, just do it.
So Steve Adams Smith, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. This is kind of a good segue into what I wanted to ask, which is about the immunity decision, and where it seems like after that, there's an unrestricted president now has absolutely no restrictions, because there's, he's a second-term president. He's almost 80 years old. He's not bound by a future election. He doesn't really seem to care about the party, and he has no legal consequence ever for anything he does officially. So then you create this dynamic, I think, sort of within the executive branch where, he's thinking, I can't issue an illegal order because nothing I do is illegal. And so then it puts the bureaucracies, DOD, and everybody else in the position of having to do what you just described. And then the turnaround is going to be, but I told you to do it. And there's no constraint on me. You may be held accountable, but, I don't care. I mean, just to sort of answer this question, I think like you see the accountability politically in Minnesota, where the demonstrations sort of reverberated a little bit, and where whether people will be held accountable is still an open question. But, Charlie, this is what you've been saying quite frequently. It's, really sort of more and more, and this may happen with Iran or Venezuela or in the Caribbean, individual people are going to probably find themselves increasingly in these ambiguous legal situations where the commander-in-chief is, forever immune, but hey, the rest of us aren't, and we have to keep facing these sort of commandments to do things that aren't legal. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that the easiest way around the presidential immunity decision is to make everybody else accountable, because the president can't do anything by himself. And if we had a culture of accountability within these agencies, if we had a more robust mechanism for holding federal officers accountable civilly or criminally when they break the law, I think that would really mitigate the effects of the Supreme Court's ruling in July of 2024. I think the problem right now is it's not just the president's immunity, it's that it is functionally impossible to sue federal officers for damages when they violate our rights. It is functionally impossible to sue the military for just about anything. And unlike the president, the latter things are fixable. So, one of the things that I hope folks take away from what's happened in Minneapolis and elsewhere is that what we really need is, a sort of a more direct path to holding government officers across the board accountable when they cross legal lines. And that, in a world in which that's true and possible and normal, presidents, I think, would find themselves running into much more internal resistance than President Trump currently is.
I think, and we have maybe time for one more quick question.
Quick question, Jean Mayer, alumni. What would be your worst case scenario for the next few years? What do you think would be the worst case scenario?
You want to go there?
This one's easy, an asteroid. I don't know.
Some would prefer the asteroid.
The asteroid. I mean, I don't know. So I don't know that worst case scenario is the way to think about this. I think there's how Capital Weather Gang has its 3 forecasts. There's what we predict, there's the boom forecast, and there's the bust forecast. I think that's probably a more useful way of thinking about this. I guess to me, the boom forecast here is a president who is able to keep exercising more and more unilateral authority, gets us into more and more messes overseas, invites retaliation, against the United States, diverts resources away from protecting the homeland from the kinds of attacks we saw And where, come 2029, we are, we've pissed off half of the world, including people who have the means to attack us. We have dramatically diluted our security, and we have diluted our commitment to democracy and the rule of law. That's a pretty bad scenario, and it's not that hard to envision if things go a particular couple ways in the next 10 months, that's where we're heading.
So I don't know about worst case scenario, but two things are particularly concerning to me. One, I said that Trump is making a bet. Right? He's betting on small airstrikes and raids without a large force. I study war for a living, and a lot of the time things just don't go the way you think they're going to go, and you get drawn further into conflicts, right? And Vietnam is an excellent example of that. So one thing that keeps me up at night is if we get stuck in a long war. We get stuck in a long war with Iran, with China, right? Which I don't think is terribly likely, but it's not impossible. And getting involved in that kind of a conflict with a bureaucracy which is going through its own convulsions, right, is a recipe for trouble. And the other thing that I do worry about, which I think is much more likely, is the institutional erosion. The idea that really talented, hardworking, patriotic people will leave service, and that they'll have enough, and it will become frustrating internally to work within the national security bureaucracy. I'm hoping that I'm wrong about that. And again, I'm hoping that AU grads and people are willing and energetic about being a part of this world, because we need you. But that is something that I do worry about in the next few years.
Charlie, you get the last word.
Oh, wow. Worst case scenario is I'd like to segue from what was just said, is that we go in for one of our lightning raids against someone who decides they're going to take it. And when we decide to go home, we find out that we have these little rats nibbling at our feet and at our tail. Everywhere we turn, we've alienated allies, and so a lot of the support that we get in protection in areas around the world, our embassies could become vulnerable. Americans living overseas become prime targets, and we wind up spreading ourselves so thin trying to fight off all of these little brush wars that we start, that we end up going into another period of unending, never-ending warfare.
Well, that's a good place for us to end never-ending warfare. But I want to thank our three incredible panelists, Charlie, Josh, and Steve. I want to thank the audience and your really excellent questions. And just to remind you, the next security talk is March 31st, 3:30 on critical minerals. Thank you all. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you got to run up. Appreciate it.